half of the 13 million registered voters are women. And both sides of the political spectrum dedicated a page each in their manifestos to addressing women's needs. In this episode, KiniFocus takes a look at the worries of women and if enough attention is being paid to their concerns. I'm here in Bangsar today to try and catch some ladies on their lunch break to ask them what they're most concerned about as women in their everyday life.
First, safety.
So I think safety. Safety, especially at night. There's some countries you can even walk at 12, 2 o'clock in the morning without being afraid of anything. But I think everybody knows it can't happen here.
Security, as in safety, because I want to go out of my house thinking that it's safe for me, especially if you look at the ladies coach nowadays. I travel by commuter, men still sitting there.
Sexual harassment kan. Kalau office, lelaki mesti buat sexual harassment.
I think respecting women in workplaces. Yeah. I feel that, when a woman has potential, they don't actually tap into it. They kind of just shove them aside and say, okay, just keep quiet, you're just a woman.
I think job opportunities or political participation, so more representation of women in politics.
At this juncture, it's actually raising a family and having a career at the same time. I think that's the key lah, because you have to juggle both. When you come home, it doesn't mean that that you can rest at home because you've got all the other work that you have to do as well.
Banyak yang tak elok. Badan yang elok.
Banyak apa tu gejala yang tak sihat.
Tak sihat lah tak. Bagus lah.
And do they think their key issue is being discussed enough in the run-up to GE13?
No. Sorry to be frank.
Not so. Rather not so.
A lot of the things that the government is trying to do, like to support women who are career women who are actually at the workplace, where they actually try and provide, like childcare centres at the workplace and all that. But I think the private sector needs to follow that as well.
Part of the manifesto that talked about gender equality or women's empowerment, but it seems very superficial because the last time the Prime Minister spoke, he said we don't even need a women's ministry. So I don't have much faith. So of course it will affect how I vote.
Some groups that advocate women's rights also aren't convinced that enough is being done to address these issues in both manifestos.
The priorities seem to be completely off base in the sense that we're focusing on getting more women into the workforce and not providing them with social safety nets, appropriate social safety nets. We're looking at uplifting our religious institutions without increasing their transparency and accountability. We're looking at reducing incidents of sexual abuse and harassment without a sexual harassment bill. I mean, what is that, And in both cases, both manifestos fall really short.
I think what they have not looked at is in the earlier initiative, especially by Barisan Nasional, where have you failed? It has a lot to do with a welfare-oriented approach. Now, what we want is an empowerment approach. And an empowerment approach means that the women's capacity to make decisions, to be involved in the income generation herself, and as well as the community involvement in the empowerment process is very fundamental.
But doesn't Pakatan promise a 30% female participation rate?
For Barisan, they were talking about the 30%. They did. It's not that they have not. But I feel that the program and the implementation and then a program to attract the government and also the government institution and also the private institution to really increase that 30% is not really there yet lah. But here when we say 30%, it has to be quality women. And secondly, there must be a time frame. It shouldn't be run forever.
And hasn't BN passed the code on eradicating sexual harassment at the workplace?
The code of practice, it is only a code. It is not a compulsory legal obligation. So that means that the company or institution are not obliged to adopt the code of practice.
And if you look at the implementation rate now of those guidelines, it's less than 3%.
They're also unhappy that Najib took it upon himself to become Women's Minister after Shahrizad.
Wanita yang apa? Wanita yang berdaya saing. Mesti ada keupayaan dan kesungguhan untuk bersaing. Bukan wanita yang pasif, bukan wanita yang fikir bahawa dia tidak boleh berjaya. Kita nak wanita yang berani bersaing.
Is there not, after all these 50 years, is there no other body in the Barisan's government to appoint a woman who is supposed to be more sensitive towards a gender issue to take over the position?
On top of that, his performance hasn't been, in that particular office, hasn't been, what's a nice way to say this? Hasn't been up to standard either. I mean, if you are the women's minister and you come out on National Women's Day and announce that the women's movement is irrelevant because Malaysia has granted its women the right to vote since independence, then you still need a lot of educating on women's issues and the status of women in your country today.
But the women's groups also warn against lumping all these concerns under the label of women's issues.
The women issue is also about class. Okay, they're not about women issue just generally, but women is also very conscious about class issue. It's also conscious about discrimination, on the ethnic ground, and discrimination on the geographical differences, the urban versus the rural.
If you make policies on the economy, they affect women. That if you make policies on employment, they affect women. Sexual harassment affects women. You know what I mean? Like, everything is interlinked. You can't really isolate one or the other and say, this is a woman's issue, because it encourages that. That's why we see women's wings dealing with women's issues.
Irene says this will require a paradigm shift in the way women are perceived.
If we look at political parties, a lot of the time when they do have meetings, and I was there, I know what it is, then after the meetings, the men have their own boys' club meetings. And where we are not part of that. And that's where a lot of discussions, strategy building is done. And so we do not become part of it, and that becomes, for me, problematic in the way we understand and perceive and make decisions. So I think there has to be a whole thinking out of the normal framework, the paradigm, so that we facilitate and create an enabling environment for women's participation. And this enabling environment is what the political parties need to define and redefine within the realities lived by women.
But is 5 years going to be enough for this change in approach to happen?
5 years will not be enough, but 5 years will be where you take bold steps, where we put policies in place, where we create the opportunities, and where the family and men will be challenged very much to ensure that participation.
And whether these bold strides will be taken now depends on how far the incoming government wants to go. Will it be brave enough to go the distance? Tamli Tianmei for KiniFocus.